Hello and welcome everybody to Vanguard Youth Radio. This is Suarez. We're going to have our guest now finally come on, our comrade Hafsa, who's going to speak to us today, particularly about how the Libyan crisis, as a result of the so-called humanitarian intervention of 2011, is directly resulting in the refugee crisis going on now in Europe. And Hafsa is a London-based journalist who's a frequent guest on Russia Today, Press TV, etc. Hafsa, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. So my first question for you is for particularly people here in America, who a lot of people are misinformed or not informed of what happened in Libya in 2011, the so-called intervention or invasion, principally by NATO and European forces, how that's directly resulting today in the refugee crisis in Europe. If you could clarify that for us.
Well, let's put it this way. Libya, prior to the NATO intervention of 2011, was the most prosperous nation in Africa. And the government ensured that both its people inside Libya were catered for, were receiving health benefits, adequately accommodated, and also the oil wealth that Libya enjoyed was also equally spread amongst other African nations, poor African nations, which were struggling. So when the intervention took place and resulted in a power vacuum, you obviously had the entire structure of the nation that collapsed. And in that collapse is where you have the rise of militia groups that take over and the entire destruction of the nation. But of course, it then becomes a hub for human traffickers, for criminals, for terrorist organizations. Now, if you couple that with the rise in poverty across Africa, and for the listeners who are not particularly familiar with the continent, the Sahel belt, which is just at the south of Libya, is a very arid part of the continent, and it's a very poor part of the continent. So when you have a power vacuum, you have the funds that were delivered by Muammar Gaddafi dry up, then you have this social context in which criminality rises. And people then flocked into Libya, and because of course there were no longer any state institutions to police its borders, to police its airports, to police the ports, therefore all those who were escaping poverty and war were looking to flee. Now obviously they weren't going to flee elsewhere in Africa, because Africa is already troubled in many parts, in particular surrounding Libya, so the obvious destination was Europe. And of course, as we've seen, because the Mediterranean Sea, although it is a lovely sea and it's where a popular tourist destination, the Mediterranean waters are incredibly choppy water. And therefore, those refugees take on dinghies to, very, very basic shuttles to cross the Mediterranean, and therefore taking on a very, very dangerous journey in which many naturally die.
Yes, and something else a lot of people don't realize is that Gaddafi encouraged his people to arm themselves. They say that dictators tend to take the guns away, that they want to have control to all the weapons. If Gaddafi was such an undemocratic leader, then why did he insist his people be armed? And not only that, you had the most sophisticated weapons. This is not a mountainous area that's hard to penetrate like Yemen or Afghanistan, by the way. This is mostly desert in Libya, and you had the most sophisticated weapons in the world used on these people. And for 6 months it took them. 6 months. And, they're bombarding towns and then bringing in these rebels. A lot of them are Chechen or from other parts of the world, Syria. These incredibly armed NATO comes in, and the European powers in America, and it took them 6 months to subjugate these people. That really says something for the resistance, right? For the green resistance in Libya.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the narrative and the way the war was sold to Western audiences was to say that Gaddafi was so unpopular that the Libyan population was begging for intervention. But then it has to beg the question, if all Libyans were that opposed to him, who actually fought NATO for 6 months? There has to be a will to fight those who opposed Gaddafi. And the fact that it took 6 months to bring him, to cause his demise, actually reveals that he still enjoyed incredible support. And of course, very, very early on, I think many Libyans realized the catastrophe country, in even those who were opposed to him, in inviting NATO. They didn't actually realize, but of course very quickly it turned into a vicious bombarding campaign that left the country utterly destroyed, the entire coastline, which took 40
I'm sorry, I
years.
just have to say real quick, Hafsa, in a debate, and I was laughing my ass off, or arse off, as they say in Britain, when this happened, in a debate that I saw you on, I think it was on Press TV, when you were talking about that, how they destroyed Libya, the guy who was opposing you, he said it was minimal, like it was minimal bombing, like that it wasn't like in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and I just started laughing because I mean, Libya, they completely destroyed the infrastructure of a country for 42 years. I mean, are you kidding me?
Well, I agree. It is tragically laughable because these are the phrases that these warmongers use. You know, when they say things like collateral damage to imply that 100 people die is almost irrelevant. You know, these are the kind of, so it's minimal damage somehow implies that it wasn't very serious, when in fact it was the absolute destruction of the entire coastline. Coastline. So the damage is considerable, and it has also contributed to giving this impression that the state has crumbled. And in a crumbled state, as I said, you know, all these evil factions actually move in and turn a failed state into their base. So this is why today you have ISIS incredibly strongly present in places like Sirte. You have the human traffickers who have found, you know, a safe haven in Libya. You have all these elements that are making the most of the situation, which didn't exist prior to 2011. The NATO invasion of Libya is one of the greatest crimes in recent history, and tragically akin to that of Iraq. Tragically, however, you know, no one appears to talk about it or denounce it as they should. And I think that is a very, very serious crime on the part of all sides of this debate.
And tell me if I'm wrong.
You have those who perpetrated the crime. Naturally, they're not
Yes.
going to.
And tell me if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure that the person who invented the word Libyan mercenary, as if there's anything wrong with other African nations helping Gaddafi, but because he was like the founder of the African Union, but I don't really see evidence of a lot of African mercenaries in Libya that were resisting. But you know, I heard that the person who invented the term was actually an African American woman named Susan Rice, who was ambassador to the U.S. at the time. She came to the UN and said, "There's Libyan mercenaries," which really meant was the black Libyans that were indigenous as part of the Libyan population. And what really confuses me, and maybe you can clarify this for me, Hafsa, I heard in the Tricontinental Conference that you had a couple years ago a mention of a black city in Libya that was under attack from Al Qaeda, by Western backed Al Qaeda. This was before ISIS was on the rise. It was a reference to, I don't know, like 5 years ago. It was like 2012 or something like that, where there was a black city in Libya. This is post Gaddafi, in the days after the so-called revolution. So there was a black city that was under attack, indigenous to Libya. And what I want to know about this is, I heard the blacks, or most of the blacks in the town, were driven out. Were these blacks armed? Was there a resistance to this? Did they have their guns taken away by the rebels that took over? What happened over there?
Well, it's good that you mentioned Susan Rice, because Susan Rice actually was responsible for many, many lies, including the myth that soldiers were using Viagra Gaddafi soldiers were using Viagra to gang rape women. This was a story that was proven to be completely false and fabricated, and organizations even like Amnesty International, which tend to really repeat the mainstream narrative, even they actually admitted that this was complete nonsense.
They actually said they were wrong, right? They said they were wrong because they initially repeated it and then they investigated it, sent people on the ground and said, actually, we found no evidence of this. And
but you see, this is the problem with these stories, because what happens is they are announced with great fanfare in the heat of battle, where everyone becomes supportive of the conflict and applauds it. And then 6 months later, when there's a small article on page 7 of some daily saying that actually we were wrong, barely gets noticed.
That should be on the front page, right?
Like
the retraction.
The woman who was, supposedly gang raped, then she was taken to Tunisia, then she went to Qatar, and then she was expelled from Qatar because it turned out she was a prostitute, as had been revealed by Libyan authorities from day one, and the stories were fabricated. But of course, the story of her handmaid made all the story of Agatha revealing that she was a liar was completely turned out. So this is how it happens. Now coming back to Tawarga, which is the city that you're referring to, this is an operation of ethnic cleansing. And this is another aspect that is never mentioned. It is the racist aspect of the conflict. Many black Libyans that people are assuming, obviously Libya is seen as an Arab country, but it has a considerable black population. It's an African nation. And there are black Libyans. But of course it was seen that any black person fighting in Libya could only be some cruel mercenaries, in a bit like the sort of film, with Leonardo DiCaprio. They were ruthless and these were Libyans who were fighting and defending their nation.
And actually, Leonardo DiCaprio played a white mercenary. If there's any mercenaries in Africa, they're white. They were recruited by South Africa from Rwanda and other countries to come to the defense of their racist regime, right?
In the film, he does kind of have some conscience, which obviously only white people are entitled to have. But all the black actors were ruthless and had absolutely no sense of humanity, as I recall, which is always the same. The white guy at least comes to some sort of point in his life where he has an epiphany and realizes he was wrong. But the black person or the brown person is inherently savage. And this, again, is very much...
Well, the black guy who was the protagonist with DiCaprio, he did save his son. So there was some good there, but you're right that the way they portrayed them with their machetes and their savage way was typical Hollywood,
Exactly, and so the idea again that these black mercenaries were cruel and were going on a rampage was part of the propaganda. These were simply Libyans trying to defend their country in the same way that any other Libyans did. And we had not just the city of Tawarga, we had a very, very nasty incident where actually black fighters were caught and placed in a cage as if they were in a human zoo.
When they captured Gaddafi, they had black soldiers with him. They were part of his guard, of his inner circle. And I believe they got lynched too.
Very inclusive politics, and was very, it was very important for him to actually unite all factions of the African country, whether it's on the continent or whether it's within Arab nations where you had, lighter-skinned Arabs and black people. So that's not remotely surprising. And because that was another aspect of the rebellion in Benghazi, because it was so focused on Africa, the attack on black-skinned Africans was deliberately an attack on his politics, because it was seen as symbolizing what he attempted to do, what he was trying to work out, etc. So there was an inherently racist element to the conflict, and also a very deliberate attempt to carry out ethnic cleansing operations, and Tawarga is a stain on that operation.
Listen, we got about 3 or 4 minutes left, so I want to bring it over to Europe and the current refugee crisis. And by the way, here in America, us that are informed about what's going on, we see Condi Rice and Susan Rice as first cousins, and we see Republicans and Democrats as the same. Because, you have this scandal with Clinton and Benghazi. But the real question is, why was McCain meeting with al-Qaeda members in Benghazi while they were lynching black Libyans in the other room? Why was there bipartisan support for terrorists, the same terrorists that killed Ambassador Stevens, when he was complaining to the State Department about the weapons given to the terrorists? I believe they took him out. They facilitated his death. That's the real treason of Hillary Clinton, not some emails. And the Republicans won't question her about it because they were complicit in this, right? If you could say what you want about that, and then please get into the refugees. Go ahead.
No, I said one of the other aspects of her criminal nature is, of course, the way she gleefully celebrating the
death
slaughter of the 70-year-old leader of Libya. There's nothing to celebrate in the way he was shamelessly captured, shamelessly executed, and then his remains shamelessly exposed to
tortured as well.
And I think that really reveals the
on
nature
camera
of the woman. And any nation who could elect such a person has an issue with its morality. I think there's no other word for it, to be honest, because the idea that Gaddafi was anything but someone trying to protect his nation from imperialist warmongers, and he was right all along. You can criticize him all you want, but there you go, the proof is in the pudding. When the opportunity arose in 2011, not only did the vultures came for Libya, but they have completely ripped it apart, and Libya is unlikely to re-emerge as a nation state anytime in the near future. It is completely fractured. also now a force for instability from across the region because its problems are seeping into its neighbors such as Tunisia, Algeria. You remember the hostage crisis of 2012 in Mali, the overtake of northern Mali a few years ago.
That was a good thing. A lot of the Gaddafi loyalists went over to Mali, and they were able to take control of land over there. But also Al Qaeda. Also, Al Qaeda took over parts of Mali as well. Yeah, so it's kind of like a counterweight.
Yeah. I'm not too happy with that, but obviously each nation needs to protect its borders and police
Right.
its own troubles, and then no one wants the overspill from Libya into their own country, irrespective. And all this catastrophe, be it the rise of ISIS in Africa, be it the refugee crisis, and just yesterday 10 more refugees drowned in the Mediterranean, barely reported. So all these issues are a direct consequence of the NATO intervention of 2011.
Exactly. That's what I want you to stress, because here in America, for example, the United States in 2009, thanks to Clinton in great part, of course, Hillary Clinton, in 2009 backed a coup against a progressive, democratically elected leader, Zelaya, in Honduras. And we see the consequences of that today. You had 100,000 children from El Salvador and Honduras that arrived at the U.S. border, and Hillary called for their deportation. And literally, Honduran children confirmed have died as a result of Obama's deportations. And in part because of Hillary's influence, even as a former Secretary of State. She said in countless interviews that these children needed to be deported. So this is a direct result of the destruction of Honduras. And in Europe, it's the same situation with Libya, because Europe, and the United States was involved, of course, but Europe principally were the actors in Libya. And now you have, as a direct result, refugees from Libya and North Africa and other parts of the world coming to Europe, and they're going to have to deal with that now as well. In a way, it's like karma, you know.
Well, it's not that much karma, because at the end of the day, no one is really dying in Europe. It's the people from the global south who are dying. I would just say, in fairness, it's not just Hillary Clinton. I think Hillary Clinton epitomizes the nature of America's foreign policy, but this has been going on for many, many years.
Yes.
And it is this idea that the people from the global south, their lives are just simply not worth anything. You can dispose of the lives of 100 people, 1,000 people, and it's completely irrelevant. We see that time and time again. If you look at we're speaking a lot about the rise of fascism in Europe, and the minute one white person dies, it becomes major news, whereas hundreds can die and it would never even feature on the 5th page of your average newspaper. So I think this sort of discrepancy between the value of life and that of an African or Middle Eastern or South American is at the heart of the problem. As long as everyone really continues to see a difference between the value of a white life and a non-white life, I think we'll continue to see these conflicts that are just viewed from a Western perspective as almost Hollywood-like problems and something to keep journalists busy. But of course, the reality on the ground is that people are dying, homes are blown up, countries are destroyed.
And absolutely, for most a dramatic example, recently, although there were a number of Hispanics shot, Orlando, they said it's the worst massacre in U.S. history. What about the U.S. soldiers that massacred over 100 Native Americans in Wounded Knee? Does that count as a U.S. massacre? Oh no, they were Native Americans, so they don't count. So absolutely, there's a double standard here.
It's absolutely shocking. And again, I mean, just recently, it's not a bad thing. The Pope, for instance, went and insisted on an apology from the Turks over the Armenian genocide, because that's a cause that's been taken over by the West. But would you imagine the Pope going to the US and actually forcing American governments to recognize the extermination of Native Americans? I very much doubt it. In fact, that's not even mentioned. What about the massacre of the Congolese people at the hands of the Belgian sovereign? 11 million Africans died in the most horrific way. Does that even feature in any history?
Well, Armenians are considered white, by the way, by the West. So, yeah.
Almost if they've acquired that status, which now makes their lives valuable. It wasn't as much before, but because they've actually been elevated to white status now, that crime has become very central to the narrative that includes Turkey. Whereas obviously, as I said, Congo or other crimes, major crimes of humanity, are simply completely ignored and no one is taking on the burden. And actually, when Africans say, well, what about our crimes? People roll their eyes up in the air and say, oh, for God's sakes, move on. Why do you still have this chip on your shoulder? So it's actually want recognition, want forgiveness, want apologies. It's simply unacceptable when the people of the global south actually request the same.
Right, and I'm really glad that you mentioned Turkey, because I guess we're going to conclude on this one. But I'm glad you mentioned Turkey because you recently debated about Turkey. I've attended protests in New York with Armenians, Greeks, Turks, Kurds even, all united together against Erdogan. I do not know how this guy still wins elections in Turkey. They got to be rigged. They got to have international observers there. They got to have international observers here in the United States during our primaries and our electoral process. But Erdogan, I mean, he's just incredibly unpopular from what I gather. I do not know how the guy's still in power, and this deal with Israel is a joke.
Actually, I have to say, I think I slightly disagree on the point that he's very unpopular. I think he came to power and he achieved a lot. The economy literally recovered under his leadership, and I think the first few years, his first few years in power, were very, very successful.
Yes, I'm talking about post flotilla. Before the flotilla, he was the hero.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean.
Right.
And then and I think what happened. Actually, it's not what I think it is. It's pretty much what happened. His role in Syria, and he got bogged down in the destruction of a neighboring country. He contributed to that, and everything went downhill from there.
Also, his deterioration with his relations with Egypt started to, yeah.
I think he mishandled that completely, and rather than being a force, and for Libya, of course, he was actually a few months before, he'd actually awarded Gaddafi some prize, and then the next thing he was actually signing up and allowing NATO planes to use Turkey.
I think Hugo Chavez was the only head of state in the world that supported Gaddafi at that time.
Yes, Algeria also refused to allow planes to fly above its airspace to bomb Libya and oppose the intervention. So obviously for Algeria it makes much more sense because it's a neighbor, it's a brotherly nation, but Hugo Chavez took a very, very firm and noble stand, absolutely, and that's worth noting. But as I said, everything he did post-Arab Spring was a complete catastrophe, and all that is happening today is almost the logical conclusion of his catastrophic last few years in power, where he has lost all the capital he'd gained in the early days of his presidency, and has actually, increased his enemies list in an incredible way. He's completely isolated and almost a national joke now. Yes,
and there's a lot of Turks that I know that are like half Kurdish, and just like with the Sunnis and Shias in Basra and other parts of Iraq, this society is integrated. But what he's trying to do is divide people. What he's ultimately doing is uniting people. Like I said, I protested a couple of years ago in New York alongside Greeks, Kurds, Armenians, Turks, and they were all united against Erdogan. And a lot of them, they had signs of Ataturk, Mustapha Kemal Ataturk, and they were just completely against what Erdogan was doing. Turkey, from the time of the Republic, was a secular state. He's trying to make it a more fundamentalist state, and as you said, he's meddling in Syria. He's reaching out to Russia and Israel now, but I don't really know what's at play here. It's kind of off topic, but it is related to the refugees in Europe, if you think about it, right? Because he's using the refugees as a bargaining chip right now. But Hafsa, I want to thank you and let you have the last word, and hopefully we can do an interview soon again, and on our actual radio show, Vanguard Radio, as well. Go ahead.
Well, listen, thank you for having me. It's really good to have an opportunity to speak about Libya because, as I said, it's never really mentioned. So, anytime you want to touch on this topic again, please don't hesitate. Thanks for having me.
Any last words about the refugee situations? Are you optimistic?
Yes and no. I think the situation in Syria might be going somewhere now that there is talk of negotiations between actually Turkey and Syria. And I think there is some chance that issue might be resolved perhaps a year, 2 years down the line, or at least the conflict reduced. Having said that, I'm not seeing the atmosphere in Europe change because there is a rise of racism that is very, very unhealthy. And I think that the use of the refugee crisis has actually been used by all the fascist elements to bring this to a head. So it's going to be worse before it improves. That's pretty much my prediction, basically.
I think that as well. I think that if, for example, Trump takes over, you're going to have massive revolts here in America, especially against his deportations. He's going to, be like Obama on steroids when it comes to deportations. But that might get the masses to actually rebel. So there's some hope, but I agree. Here in America and in Europe as well, things have to get worse first before they can get better. But thank you so much, Hafsa, for calling in.
Okay, no problem. Bye.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to Blog Talk Radio.